It was Trump's military parade down in DC, and all of that was supported in part by your friends at Coinbase. If you look at some of the takes, they're mostly like, hey, you can sponsor a lot of things. It doesn't need to be a military parade. I think that might be, less controversial to sponsor a community-owned show that is built on chain, perhaps. And it's certainly less money that we need around here than I think a military parade. But who am I to say? Who am I to say that Coinage might be a better place to sponsor? Welcome in, everybody, to another episode of Coinage. I'm your host, Zach Guzman, coming to you live from our Brooklyn studios here in New York City as we are tracking everything going on in the wild world of Web3. Is it so wild anymore? I really don't think it is that wild anymore. I think we've settled in. Case in point, Coinbase is out there sponsoring the big Trump military parade, which we're going to dive into a little bit in a second on the blowback that Coinbase is seeing around that, as well as the big moves from Justin Sun and TRON working with the Trumps. Not exactly too surprising when you consider he's one of the largest holders of the Trump meme coin and how involved in DC he's been recently. And want to focus a little bit in on Ethereum as it continues to see some love, not just through inflows that we've been tracking as well, but also in the public markets too, as the Ethereum co-founder-led Joe Lubin project, SBET, which we're going to get into, catching some love from our friends over at Fundstrat. So a lot to focus in on as Ethereum continues to lead crypto and TRON gets the Trumps involved with their plans. Thanks for joining us here. If you don't know us at Coinage, we're the only community-owned show here in Web3. You can head to coinage.media to mint an NFT and co-own a chunk of the show and brand with us. Do want to show our charts, though, as we kick off and are watching the levels today on Ethereum holding north of that 2600 level, which is interesting considering, we've seen rising tensions across the pond in the Middle East and weirdly enough, crypto not really seeing too much of an impact. Same story on the Bitcoin side as we're seeing Bitcoin trade north of $107,000. If you had told me a year ago that we'd be north of 100K even as missiles were being launched back and forth from Israel and Iran, I don't know if I would have thought that would be possible, but here we are holding steady. Of course, we've got a big Fed announcement coming later this week as well to keep our eyes on. The market mostly expecting rates to be unchanged in that one, though again, you never know with what we've been seeing play out in DC. But want to kick the show off this week with a focus on not just ETH itself, but mostly the story going on behind the scenes with ETH. There's a couple things to tease out. Texas, why don't we start before we get into the SBET call itself? Why don't we start just with a check on fund flows, because our friends at CoinShares compile this every week. And pretty interesting to consider that, this is now the 9th consecutive week. We were getting a little worried last week, but big inflows this week as you see a huge bounce back. In total, almost $2 billion in inflows. And the key breakout that we've been watching is how Ethereum has been performing relative to Bitcoin, because usually Bitcoin's the one that steadies this and is the bulk of fund flows just because of how big Bitcoin's asset class is with all those ETFs. And of course they were, with $1.3 billion in inflows, the bulk again. But Ethereum, not to be outdone here, saw more than $500 million in inflows. That was its strongest performance since February. So continuing this trend, the trend of ETH kind of standing out against other cryptos, not, a huge chunk, but still showing strength, the strongest week since February, and brings its run to $2 billion in inflows in total. So pretty important there. And also, as we've been highlighting, not just Bitcoin treasury companies to worry about anymore. The big one, an Ethereum treasury company, SBET, as we've been tracking it, is the one that our friends at Fundstrat have been saying could potentially now be in a region where you might want to add it to your crypto equities side of your portfolio. Just want to bring up a tweet that got a lot of love. Shout out to Fundstrat's Tom Lee, who's rarely wrong. Of course, we lean on Fundstrat for a lot of the research here. Rarely wrong. And Sean Farrell as well, writing this note highlighting that SharpLink Gaming may be worth adding to portfolios here. We believe it offers intriguing upside at these prices. I tweeted this out on Friday. This was back when it was at $9.21. And we're going to bring up the SBET chart in a second because it's trading well beyond that now. And perhaps it's because people are agreeing with what we are seeing here in the idea that ETH could just be beaten down and left for dead. And if that's the case, could the market be mispricing what we see here? Texas, if we have, before we show the SBET chart and kind of where we're at now, just want to take a look at that ETH BTC chart because we've been highlighting this over the last few weeks, and it's gotten more interesting because as we see it trade sideways for longer, that's usually indicative of when we see a relative breakout. And so I don't want to overlook that, a couple weeks ago, we thought as it hit that line, it would be bouncing back down and trade below it, as has been the trend. But as it goes sideways longer, some people might say, hey, that's not great. I would disagree and say, hey, maybe prepare thyself for the reckoning that could be. And I'm not an ETH maxi, let's be clear. But I do want to bring up this chart because this is what it looks like in SBET right now. And of course, you could say, whoa, that's a huge fall off from 32. And the market did react to a new listing, an SEC listing from SBET, in terms of saying that they may be offering more shares, just that they could offer more shares. And then, we saw this note issued from Fundstrat saying, look, 1.6 times, a little bit of a premium to net asset value of how much ETH they hold. 1.6 versus 1.9, roughly in line with where the market is pricing MicroStrategy and the premium on the Bitcoin that they hold. And so generally just flagging this as a potential opportunity here if you think that ETH is going to rally. This is one of those most highly watched publicly trading ETH treasury companies because, as I said, has Joe Lubin involved, up 34% today. And so when you look at the week chart, maybe not so great, but when you look at the day chart, and obviously if I'm able to say up 34% in a day, maybe that catches some more attention here as it was at $9 on Friday, opening and trading well here, $12.50 on Monday. And we'll see how that plays out throughout the week. But just flagging that as potentially one of those important stories to watch as ETH finally, perhaps, gets its act together as it bounces off the lows. Could it be the 8th time we say as it bounces off the lows in terms of ETH BTC? Potentially, but it's holding north of 2,600. And if we see a bump in crypto, it's not just me saying this, it's Fundstrat now as well. Ethereum could be best positioned to lead that rally. And so we're keeping our eyes on SBET and the public market love still coming back to that name. I want to check what I said there, though, because I want to be right here. Yes, SharpLink 1.6 NAV premium. Strategy 1.9 premium. So below it. Anyways, we'll move on because it's not just Ethereum that we're watching. It's also TRON. And that is because Justin Sun, the TRON founder, is back with some news. I want to see what TRON's doing off this because it's only up slightly here. This is the long-term TRON chart over the last year. You can see how that's performed. And I think it's interesting because I read this headline and I was like, is that true? Could that be possible? How is this going to happen? Because the headline is this. Justin Sun, his group TRON to go public. And lo and behold, who's involved? Eric Trump. And the reason why that's interesting is because it wasn't so long ago that the SEC had Justin Sun in their crosshairs. In fact, I was looking through the press release back here from March of 23, highlighting the celebrities that TRON had worked with and the wash trading that they had accused Justin Sun of perpetrating to pump TRON's price. And so that investigation, very interestingly, kind of got wound down as more news came out around Justin Sun's involvement with the president's meme coin and how he was one of the largest holders in the Trump meme coin. And so if you square those pieces together, perhaps not too surprising that you might see an investigation like that wound down, flipped, and forgotten. But nonetheless, what's happening here is not really an IPO, and I think that's worth highlighting because as we saw with Galaxy getting listed here in the US, it does take a lot of people signing off on it. And if you have any issue or misdeeds from your past, it may be blocked. And so worth highlighting here that it's not exactly an IPO that we're going to be watching for with TRON and Eric Trump. but rather a reverse merger to go public, which is obviously a lot easier in terms of paths to get to become a publicly traded company. But yeah, these were the headlines that are before. So I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but if you want to pair these and say, okay, Justin Sun was being investigated in the last administration with Tron, and now, after becoming one of the largest Trump meme coin holders, now is seeing a potential path to become a publicly traded company. So interesting, worth watching, certainly, on that front. If it does happen, by the way, I think it'd be fair to say that this would be one of those stories that, again, if you told me a year ago, hey, did you know that Eric Trump, the president's son, is going to be involved with Justin Sun in a deal to take Tron public? I would have said very unlikely. And yet, here we are, just 4 months after we saw the SEC pull off the dog, so to speak, in that investigation. Now you've got headlines like this, with images like this, by the way, Texas, in terms of what we saw back at that big party in D.C. to celebrate the Trump meme coin community. Very interesting developments. And also not too far removed, by the way, from when we saw the battle between Eric Trump's DeFi project, World Liberty Financial, and the meme coin wallet, and their deal with Magic Eden basically gets scrapped after Eric Trump and Don Jr. said, we don't know anything about that project. So Trump's crypto endeavors somewhat stepping on its own toes. And so kind of interesting to see how this one might fit into the overall portfolio of how Trump is getting involved in crypto. But nonetheless, that is the news there, a public listing to keep our eye on in the world of Tron. Kind of wonder how long we might have to wait for this, because again, it's going to be involving 210 million tokens, $200 million worth of Tron tokens involved in all this, and shares of SRM Entertainment. So this is the entity that might be involved here in trading this. Just want to bring that up real quick too. Why don't we do that, Texas, over here? Yeah, sure enough, getting a lot of love. Should I use my former? There we go. Let's go over here. Yeah, that's about right. That's usually in line with what we see on news like this. And again, not too dissimilar from what we just showed you with SBET. So again, the trend is public markets trading tied to an asset, in this case Tron, and we'll keep our eyes on all of that happening. My producer giving me a dirty look as I just went rogue on the old on my screen over here, just bringing up whatever. Anyways, that is one thing to watch. And as we talk Trump and Tron, perhaps a good segue into the festivities over the weekend. Not sure if you celebrated, ladies and gents. Maybe you celebrated by protesting what we saw play out over the weekend. Maybe that was your way. Perhaps you joined the No Kings protests out there as well. But if you didn't, maybe you watched it. It was Trump's military parade down in D.C., of course, showing off the military strength and might of the United States of America. And all of that was supported in part by your friends at Coinbase. And pretty interesting to consider the blowback there, because Coinbase was obviously part of this. Let me just bring up the tweet here. And the reaction from the wider world of crypto Twitter. But this tweet kind of blew up from Luke Metro, taking the screenshot of the Coinbase ads displayed there at the parade. There was another clip that kind of went viral around the announcer, the PA announcer, saying, and thank you to our friends at Coinbase for sponsoring. And so a lot of people on crypto Twitter were none too pleased with the idea of Coinbase sponsoring a military parade, including Nick Almond here, calling it pretty gross. And it is interesting to kind of think about that, because, of course, a lot of crypto and crypto aficionados are not too tied to the likes of the U.S. government, or any government for that matter, kind of trying to build money apart from the state. We've heard this from Eric Voorhees and a bunch of other OGs in the space, is that you don't really want that. And so Victor here from Coinbase also responding in part, saying the men and women defending our nation and our way of life deserve our respect and support. Coinbase is based and ahead of the curve on cultural issues yet again. And I'm not so sure that a lot of people on crypto Twitter would necessarily agree with that take. But nonetheless, pretty interesting to see Coinbase sponsoring. And as we know, as we've covered, Coinbase and Stand With Crypto and the rest of a lot of the exchanges, including Gemini, the Winklevoss twins, basically all the big players in the industry being involved in spending in DC this last election cycle. So not too crazy to see that they would be involved at Trump's military parade as well. But certainly, if you look at some of the takes, they're mostly like, hey, you can sponsor a lot of things. It doesn't need to be a military parade. And frankly, we've had Stand With Crypto as a sponsor before. I think that might be, less controversial to sponsor a community-owned show that is built on chain, perhaps. And it's certainly less money that we need around here than I think a military parade. But who am I to say? Who am I to say that Coinage might be a better place to sponsor for a crypto company who's trying to get in with the crypto crowd, someone who's walking the walk, than a military parade for the United States government? Of course, you can support the Army different ways. I don't know if a military parade and sponsoring it. Never mind. I'm going to leave that there. There's no need to get into this. I'm just the guy reporting the news, and the blowback on crypto Twitter, pretty interesting to see play out. Elsewhere, though, it's not just ETH treasury companies or Solana treasury companies, as we highlighted recently. It's also good old-fashioned Bitcoin treasury companies to keep our eyes on as well. And speaking of Coinbase, I'm crushing it with the segues today, Texas. Speaking of Coinbase, we also had the Japanese publicly traded company Metaplanet surpass Coinbase in this list tracked by BitcoinTreasuries.net. It's a little big, a little small on your screen maybe, so maybe I can zoom in here. But this is basically where Metaplanet is, and they jumped Coinbase as they stacked some more sats, becoming the number 9 Bitcoin holder, buying another more than 1,100 Bitcoin for $117 million. And I suppose I could also bring up one of the other big purchases from Michael Saylor and Strategy. Of course, they've got a plethora of options and ways to play the strategy around strategy, no pun intended. But it is, again, an increasing thing to watch just in terms of the size of all these. This is the tweet from Saylor as he stepped in. And again, it's not the size, I don't think, of these things, but it's just the cadence in which you need to sell the public market to say, look, we're going to keep doing this. And this is what we saw from Saylor. Speaking of, they acquired 10,000 Bitcoin for $1.05 billion. So blowing Metaplanet out of the water, at least in that purchase. But all these companies basically running back Saylor's playbook, Metaplanet being one of the largest as they pass Coinbase. Definitely, certainly worth pointing that out, I think. Definitely, certainly. Can we do 2 adverbs on this show? I think so. And outside of all that, I don't think it'd be a complete show without continuing to highlight some of what's happening in the Solana world, because as we await that ETF, again, mounting confidence around the chances. We saw the Bloomberg boys. It's been a while since we had Jeff on the show. Maybe we should have him back. We saw the Bloomberg boys talking about odds that a Solana ETF would be approved, because we saw the SEC ask those issuers to come back and update their filings. We also now have seen one of the latest filings, CoinShares, submitting their S1 for a Solana ETF, and they join the likes of 7 other issuers seeking a Solana ETF, including the first one. We just had them on the show not too long ago. Van Eck, 21 Shares, Bitwise, Franklin Templeton, Grayscale, Fidelity Investments, and Canary. A lot of people trying to be the first, and as we've seen with the SEC, they normally just lump these together and approve them all at the same time. But odds increasing that we could see that happen relatively soon. And of course, the big question is, will it perform more like a Bitcoin ETF, which saw huge inflows and a huge spike in Bitcoin's price, or will it perform more like an ETH ETF, which didn't really do jack shit, if I want to use the financial term? And yeah, if we take a look at Solana pricing here right now, kind of weird price action, to be honest with you, over the last year. We, of course, did top and hit a new all-time high in this cycle. Or maybe was that an all-time high just in general? Yeah, it was. North of 250 back in November, and now trading in this 160 level. And I think a lot of people are hoping that this will perform differently than the Ethereum ETF. But, of course, as we know, and as we've seen before, you never really know how these things are going to go. And the big question is, what does institutional demand look like? Do they trust that Solana is more like a Bitcoin, akin to that? Or they have the marginal buyers out there who are interested in this? And in a unique way to wrap up the show today, rather than me just babble on about the upcoming Fed decision that we'll be watching and tracking for you on Wednesday, which will probably be the big market swinger of the week, even though we're not expecting interest rates to get cut, we will hear from Jay Powell. And in that speech, we'll learn a little bit more about his thoughts on how everything, probably whether it's tied to tariffs dissipating, I should say, or some of the tensions or some of the debt that may be impacted by what we see play out in DC. Or, by the way, I should highlight that we might see a final vote, I think tomorrow, on the Genius Act. So again, that may be something worth considering in our weekly recap to keep our eyes on as well. But as I said, a lot to watch in the world of Solana because these ETFs could be coming within, I think, a matter of weeks, if not months. But certainly the odds and expectations are that we do get this either Q3 or Q4 in watching all of those S1s. And we recently caught up with Multicoin, one of the large Solana-based VCs out there, Kyle Samani, one of the earliest investors in Solana, and the company is levered to that ecosystem. We chatted with him on the sidelines of Solana Accelerate out here in New York to get his take on how Solana's been stacking up to Ethereum, and very interesting interview, I think, and maybe sets the expectations around why so many institutions may be seriously waiting for those ETFs and could, again, be more like a Bitcoin ETF launch than an ETH ETF launch. But we're going to end the show on this Recap Monday with that interview, which means I will sign off now because you won't see me again. But enjoy our interview with Kyle Samani. I think it was very interesting. And of course, as always, you can head to Coinage.media to not just stay up to date on all the big stories in Web3, but also co-own our community-owned outlet with us and enjoy the power that comes with being a digital co-op member here at Coinage. We'll see you again soon. Enjoy this chat with Kyle Samani.
Bitcoin alone is 2 trillion, and let's say everything else adds up to 1 trillion, or plus or minus. Who would have thought 15 years ago that you could get to that scale without kind of formal blessing? To go from 3 trillion to 50 trillion over the next decade, like that's the kind of scale we're talking about. The entire market can easily 10x with this next major unlock from Congress.
All right, we're here with Kyle Samani, co-founder, managing partner at Multicoin. Kyle, good to see you, man.
Zach, thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here on the floor of Accelerate because I think, the space has come so far. You guys, one of the largest investors in terms of Solana ecosystem projects. What's it like for you being here, seeing all this happen now?
I mean, it's awesome to be here, and especially in the U.S. The last 4 breakpoints were all outside the U.S. And the day after the election, Raj, Lily, and the team, they were like, we got to do something in the U.S. ASAP. So they got this turnaround in 6 months. And seeing the energy and excitement, and obviously seeing Kraken launch equity, U.S. equities on chain yesterday with Solana, I was like, this is exactly what we wanted to see. Super cool to see all this innovation coming out in the U.S.
Yeah, and I mean, here you have the chair of the House Financial Services Committee talking about everything as well. Obviously, there is a big unlock, and how much of that right now is being captured by Solana ecosystem projects in your eyes?
I mean, if you look today at I think where the substantial majority of intellectual capital building in crypto today is in Solana ecosystem. There's probably 2 metrics I would use to kind of try and capture that. The first is Electric Capital. They publish a developer report every 6 months or so. And the last time they published it was a couple months ago. And Solana is now the leading ecosystem by number of developers. This was completely implausible 2 years ago. And today Solana is number 1 on that metric. The other one that I look at that I actually think is a better metric is to look at the crypto-specific incubators and looking at what percentage of their applications and accepted teams. Alliance, I kind of think, is generally considered the leading accelerator. And the Alliance guys said in their most recent batch that I think 70% of their applications and accepted founders are building on Solana.
Yeah.
Ultimately, those are going to be the next pump funds and all those things, and they're all on Solana now.
Well, I feel like we're also getting into this chapter, and you can kind of feel it. Like we were just down with the Crypto Task Force chatting with Hester Peirce about real projects being able to deliver real value back to people. And for so long, it's been kind of like this, tokenomics here, tokenomics there. But we're getting into the era, I think, where there's a real ownership at play, and people building in the space aren't afraid of that anymore. We're talking about the Genius Act potentially coming through as well, so huge liquidity unlocks. I mean, when you look at that and a bunch of money about to come into stablecoins, how do you see that impacting kind of the size of the prize?
It's honestly amazing the crypto as a whole is as big as it is, given that at least in the United States, it's pseudo like not legal. It's been in somewhere between black and gray for like 15 years, and like Bitcoin alone is 2 trillion. I'd say everything else adds up to 1 trillion, or plus or minus. Who would have thought 15 years ago that you could get to that scale without kind of formal blessing? To go from 3 trillion to 50 trillion over the next decade, like that's the kind of scale we're talking about. The entire market can easily 10x with this next major unlock from Congress.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess related to that, are big traditional players now wanting to tap crypto native players? You mentioned Kraken as kind of one example. The other one, you're about to go have a chat with the co-founder of Kalshi here. Talk to me about what you're seeing there in terms of other existing players now looking small relative to what maybe a Kalshi is unlocking.
If you look at like the opportunity for someone like a Kalshi, today they're a fintech business. They don't really have much crypto in there, fully regulated by the CFTC. And obviously, Kalshi guy is here because he's going to talk about some crypto stuff. Excited to talk with him here in a few minutes. But I can tell you in my conversations with Tarek that he believes that like the future of finance is on chain. And look, he's building prediction markets not for the United States, but for the world. Obviously, he's regulated in the US, he's CFTC regulated, but ultimately the aspirations for a company like Kalshi are global. And people are going to predict and bet on event contracts and event outcomes in every single country around the world, and I think the only path for someone like Kalshi to get there is on something like Solana.
When we talk about Solana specifically, one of the things you and I were chatting about before we started was the ecosystem, the community, the kind of momentum that's been built now. Having lived through a pretty dark crypto winter, how do you stack that up against other ecosystems building? I know you have some spicy takes around Base and Coinbase's hand in that ecosystem and L2s. But there's also, the counterparts like SWE that are starting to maybe take some projects from the Solana ecosystem too. How do you look at maybe the moat that Solana has?
Yeah, I mean, the moat of any asset ledger, whether it's an L1 or an L2, is some combination of number of developers, number of users, amount of liquidity, amount of trading volume, market makers plugged in, and very importantly, all the on and off ramps, meaning the exchanges and MoonPays and stuff like that. Today, Solana is the only first-class citizen in addition to Ethereum. There isn't another first-class citizen that has like global acceptance from all of the kind of major players around the world.
Yeah.
For a long time, if you were in crypto, it seemed impossible for anyone to get there because Ethereum was so dominant and it was so hard to get all those pieces together. The reality is that the Ethereum guys just totally missed the mark. They didn't scale. Gas fees spiked through the roof. People got really pissed and they said, okay, like these guys don't care about my user experience, I'm going to go elsewhere. And Solana was really the primary beneficiary of that. Today, median transaction fees on Solana are a tenth of a penny, even when you've got tens of thousands of TPS running through the system, even through Trump coin launch and stuff like that. And so the thing that I just wonder about for all of these new L1s and L2s is like, well, what's the reason for your system to achieve escape velocity and become something that is kind of a global first-class citizen beyond cheap and fast?
Yeah.
And the SWE and a bunch of these other teams, they always say we're cheaper, faster, and I'm not here to say they are or aren't. I don't actually know. But it's just like, well, if median transaction fees on Solana are a tenth of a penny, it's just like you're getting really close to zero.
Sure.
And so it's just kind of like, but obviously $50 versus a tenth of a penny is like a pretty big improvement. Tenth of a penny to, it doesn't really move the needle anymore.
Sure.
And that's the kind of the thing that, that's the big question I have. And look, I've spoken to every L1 and L2 founder who has tried to build an L1 or L2 in the last decade.
Yeah.
And I've asked all of them, I'm like, what are your ideas besides cheap and fast?
Well, yeah, I mean, I feel like it's not even just the cheap and fast at this point. Like, again, we launched our Play Button meme coin in Solana mostly because there's an ecosystem built around understanding these things and,
Correct.
and the infrastructure for it to be there. And so it is kind of interesting to see. But you having so many kind of portcos building on Solana, and we love asking really smart people for their bold predictions. We're about halfway through the year here in 25. What do you see shaping up when you put all those pieces together? The unlocks that we just talked about, how high do you see kind of Solana's price going? How do you look at that when you kind of forecast everything?
Not here to make near-term price predictions. I can talk about, I think, ecosystem. I think what you will see by the end of this calendar year in the Solana ecosystem is the following. The system will be substantially more performant than it is today. Total throughput will go up, latency will go down. I think you will see permissioned and regulated asset issuers issuing the substantial majority of their assets on Solana. Yep. Today it's still mostly on Ethereum, but I think that's going to shift very quickly. I think Kraken's announcement yesterday is kind of the harbinger of a lot of that to come. I think you're going to see the major DePIN teams like Helium and HiveMapper are going to go have breakout years in the back half of this year. And I think you're going to see the market structure on Solana evolve to be much more efficient, meaning like all of these like bad sandwiches and bad sniping and all this stuff, that's always here because of the market structure was a little immature, and all of the solutions to those problems are like rolling out kind of now-ish. Yep. And I think by the end of this year, you'll have a much more efficient and safer and better market structure for retail investors.
Last question real quick, on a scale of 1 to 10, how crazy is it to kind of think about the bear market, Solana being branded a Sam coin back when FTX collapsed, to be here and have everything blown up?
It's an incredible feeling to be here, and I'm so grateful to the Solana community and the teams who have made it all happen. It was a really dark time, but look, a lot of these guys, like, they still believed, and they were like, look, like, just because like this other guy was a bad dude doesn't mean Solana's bad, and they stuck it out, and a bunch of them almost died, and we had to help a bunch of them stay alive, and they stuck it through, and now they're being rewarded for that conviction.
And now, again, the ecosystem, having lived through it, kind of some camaraderie around all of it. But Kyle Samani, Multicoin co-founder, thank you so much, man. Appreciate you being
pleasure.
here.
Thank you.
Thank you.